take some room.
Everywhere I go, I'm in the spotlight. This is a good life. I'm living bold. This is what it looks like on the tip of the world.
Last week was such a lengthy discussion between Dr. Sal Mercogliano and myself that I thought this week we could just keep it a little shorter, take inventory of some of the things that I'm watching and some of the notable things in the news. So it's a Captain's Log edition. Let's dive in. Hi, welcome to By Land and By Sea, an attorney breaking down the week in supply chain, presented by the Maritime Professor, me. I'm Lauren Began, founder of the Maritime Professor and Squall Strategies, and I'm your favorite maritime attorney. Join me every week as we walk through both ocean transport and surface transport topics in the wild world of supply chain. As always, the guidance here is general and for educational purposes only. It should not be construed to be legal advice, and there is no attorney-client privilege created by this video. If you need an attorney, contact an attorney. So, like I said, today is a special edition. We do this periodically. It's the Captain's Log edition, where we just kind of go over everything that's going on out there. Instead of top 3 stories of the week, they're all top stories, right? We're just kind of taking inventory of what's going on. So the first one that I wanted to cover, story number 1 or topic number 1, is some of the proposed pending legislation on the Hill. There's 3, maybe 4 major bills that I'm watching, so I just kind of wanted to talk about them. We talked about them a little bit last week with Dr. Mercogliano, but I wanted to kind of, like I said, take inventory, put it all out there. So the first one that we're watching that was introduced a few weeks ago is the Ocean Shipping Antitrust Enforcement Act. And what this does is it seeks to repeal certain exemptions from antitrust laws. I talked about this with Dr. Mercogliano last week. So this is how it was promoted as it was released. Is it says address unfair practices that harm American businesses, producers, and consumers, such as unjustified container rate increases and refusing cargo bookings for American exports. The bill was introduced last week, which was a few weeks ago, by California Democrats Jim Costa, John Garamendi, Josh Harder, and Jimmy Panetta, and South Dakota Republican Dusty Johnson. So what this does, we've talked about alliances before, right? And they basically are monopolies, but they're allowed to be monopolies under antitrust, under some certain antitrust laws that allowance laws. I'm losing the word here, right? But they're allowed to be monopolies because the FMC receives their filing of the agreements and then monitors them. So it happens in a couple of the other agencies or a couple of the other industries out there. Look, alliances serve a very important purpose. I know that it's kind of in vogue right now to not like alliances, but they really do. We've talked about kind of the different ways that they service, but most importantly is the routing, right? Some of these smaller ports, some of these secondary ports, even American ports are serviced because instead of having 3 ships do the same route, each half full, the alliances allow it so that they can vessel share, that they can share that route, fill up one ship, use that route, and then those 2 other ships are now free to go somewhere else, to go into lesser used or smaller ports or wherever it is. If we get rid of these alliances, if we get rid of the antitrust protections that we afford them, because we are watching them, the Federal Maritime Commission is charged with watching them, monitoring them, making sure that they're not getting to a monopolistic, harmful level. And I think that the FMC does a good job. The Federal Maritime Commission does a good job with that. I just don't think outright getting rid of it is the answer. And the other thing that Dr. Mercogliano and I talked about is that we can't really look at this in a vacuum, right? We just because the United States, it's in vogue right now to not like alliances service the entire global supply chain. And so by saying that the FMC or by saying that the United States is going to get rid of the alliance protection, the enjoying of the alliance waiver, the exemption. Sorry, that is the word that I've been looking for. Exemption, alliance, antitrust exemption. Oh gosh. By getting rid of that exemption, I mean, that's going to have global ramifications. So you're either going to see 2 things. 1, alliances go down across the world, or 2, maybe the alliances stay around, which I'm not sure, that would be very operationally difficult, but maybe they stay around and they just reduce their service to the U.S. I don't know. This is really, it's just a tricky thing. It sounds interesting. I'm not sure how far this bill is actually going to go. It sounds interesting. It sounds like, somebody's sticking it to the man. They're going after the alliances. But like I said, I just don't think that this is the right move. I think that alliances serve a very important service to the global supply chain. I think that they actually do keep the costs down in general because they afford for a better way of managing the vessel sharing, the equipment, the operational side of things. It's just, it either needs a lot more thought and a lot more discussion over some of the repercussions, or it was just a political statement bill, and that's where it lies. So I don't know. I wanted to bring that up. I think it's interesting. It's worth watching. I just, like I said, I don't think that this is the right direction. All right, the other bill, the next bill I'm watching, this whole bill section, like I said, this is a topic area. This whole bill section, OSRA 2.0, right? So OSRA 2.0 is a little bit incorrectly named because, as we all know, who listen to By Land and By Sea, there was OSRA 1998, which, if you're going to count the OSRAs, that was the first. And then we have OSRA of 2022, which we've recently called OSRA 1.0. It's not. It was technically the second OSRA. And then now we have a new OSRA, Ocean Shipping Reform Act, that's being promoted and proposed. It is the Ocean Shipping Reform Implementation Act of 2023. So technically this would be OSRA 3.0, but in kind of casual conversation, it's called OSRA 2.0. Originally, it was kind of being put together. I kept hearing OSRA technical corrections, but then it really kind of got expanded, and I think it does a little bit more than just correct technical things that the House thought were missing from OSRA, the 2022 version. So co-sponsors Dusty Johnson of South Dakota and John Garamendi of California are the ones that promoted this and proposed this. The two things that I really thought were interesting, and Dr. Mercogliano and I talked about this last week a little bit more in detail. Go check out last week's episode. We really got into some really interesting areas. But the open data standard and the open data standard rulemaking I thought was really interesting, a unique addition to the overall language. And I think it's a move in the right direction for the industry. These data standards, we keep hearing them come up and all around. And, it's not talking about the platform, but it's talking about the data standards and kind of the vocabulary, as Commissioner Bensel usually calls it, the lexicon, the glossary. It's getting all the terms so that everyone's speaking the same language. I think that that's probably a move in the right direction. So that was one piece that I liked of this Ocean Shipping Reform Implementation Act of 2023. And then also I like the Seaport Advisory Committee. So we've seen the Shipping Advisory Committee as one of the committees, the federal advisory committees of the Federal Maritime Commission. Now this is really something that Commissioner Dye recommended earlier, that we expand that to not just shippers, not just importers, exporters, but also to seaports. So the proposal has 16 port authorities and 8 MTOs. I like it. I think that that's great. I think that they are a critical piece of the whole conversation, right? If you have a boat and you have people on the land that need it, you need the ports. So to have the ports as part of that discussion is so critically important. So I'm interested to see how this OSRA 2.0, like I said, incorrectly named, but OSRA 2.0, casual conversation of that, OSRA Shipping, the Ocean Shipping Reform Implementation Act 2023. Interested to see, right? Because this is only the House version that's been introduced. We still have to see a Senate version, and they would both have to get passed, and then they would have to be matched up, and then it goes to special committee, and then it goes to the president. So we'll see, right? I like that it's still being discussed. I like that global shipping is still in conversation. We just have to do it correctly when we have to do it with, now we don't have the emergency situation that we used to have, but we need to do it thoughtfully and fully kind of understand the repercussions of some of the things that might be happening from quick movement otherwise here. This is where I say like 3, maybe 4 rules. The FMC Alliance Denial Authority wasn't in this OSRA 2.0. So that's something that Commissioner Bensel and Commissioner Vekich had promoted, saying that this was something that was important to the FMC. I've talked about it before, that the FMC, when alliance agreements are filed with the FMC, And like I said, that's part of the antitrust exemption, is that the FMC receives the agreement and then they also monitor the agreement through the life of the agreement. But the FMC is not allowed to deny the agreement when it's filed. There's some talk about whether they should or they shouldn't, if this is a real problem or if it's not a real problem. But I guess my example is, what if somebody proposes an 80% market share? The FMC should be able to kick that out and say, no, market share is way too high. It wasn't in any of the rules. This alliance denial authority was not in any of these rules. I think that's something also worth discussing, the specifics of which I think, whether there's a threshold associated with it, whether it's something that maybe it's something worth looking at, because it feels notably missing from the FMC's authority. But we'll see. So the third/fourth, whether you count that denial authority as maybe a standalone bill that we might see come forward, is a birthing preference bill. So again, House Member John Garamendi introduced American Port Access Privileges Act, and actually it's a reintroduction. And he did it with Representatives Jim Costa, Jimmy Panetta, and Mike Thompson, all of California. So what the kind of pitch and promotion, this was promoted actually or released in February, mid-February. It seeks to put U.S. exporters at the front line of our ports, supporting the American economy and reducing our long-standing trade deficit. That's kind of the pitch. Basically what this does is it's berthing preference, right? So it's when a vessel comes in, when it sits at a port, we call that berthing, when it docks, essentially. And so this is trying to use berthing preference. Think back to like when there were 100 ships offshore, right? We didn't really have a lot of preferential treatment on, you get in line and then you wait to be serviced. What if you could skip that line? And I think that's kind of what they're thinking here. So this American Port Access Privileges Act does a few things. One thing that I really like about it is it codifies the current preferences for military Jones Act and other U.S. flagged vessels in place at many major American ports. That's what this rule is actually saying, that this is already something that happens quite a bit. It would just codify it. It would just turn it into a rule. Other things that this proposed legislation does is it establishes a second berthing preference for ocean-going commercial vessels servicing multiple ports in the United States or with significant cargo bookings of American exports. And so the thought here is that either we are creating preferential treatment for vessels who say we will take a lot of exports. And so I guess presumably if you have a certain percentage of exports, that means you kind of go faster in line. Or also, this is really interesting, it said multiple ports in the United States. So there's two things that I really want to point out here. You can't pick up cargo in Oakland and drop off cargo in LA that you picked up in Oakland, because that's cabotage. And cabotage is protected for U.S. flag fleet. That's something that the Jones Act covers. That's for a U.S. flag vessel to be able to do that, to move from coastwise trade to coastwise trade. So basically, U.S. port to U.S. port. If you're moving from one port to another, it has to be a U.S. flag vessel. You can, however, pick up in Oakland and then pick up new in LA. If you're picking up exports, you can pick up exports in Oakland, and as long as you're not dropping those exports off in LA, you can pick up new exports in LA. You could drop off cargo that you had on board at Oakland, didn't touch it, and then you could drop it off at LA. You just can't move from one port to the other. I hope that kind of makes sense. But basically what they're saying is, if you want to drop off and pick up, or if you're going to be moving to a bunch of these different ports, it's going to incentivize ocean carriers to make second leg voyages to port. So instead of just going big port and we're out of here, they're saying we want to incentivize diversification of ports. And maybe this might hit some of the smaller ports that otherwise might not get that primary port entry or routing that would have otherwise been. So it's an interesting proposal for that. I don't hate that, right? I mean, I don't hate that it's pushing to some of these other ports. But you have to be careful, right? You have to be careful manipulating the market too much here. Okay, so what else is it doing? It's also requiring the export carrying vessels seeking preferential berthing report cargo bookings at least 7 days in advance to port operators. All right, that's pretty good, right? You want to have advanced information. This is requiring 7 days in advance, at least 7 days. And also this proposed bill, and remember it's a proposed bill, is saying that the U.S. Department of Transportation's Bureau of Transportation Statistics, BTS, can collect data on berthing and cargo preferences or practices at U.S. ports. So data is always a good thing, right? So look, interesting proposals all around here on this one. There's some things that I like in it, some things that I do think kind of go too far. I'm really interested what you think here. I like the codified preference for the U.S. flag fleet. Like I said, I think that is helpful for promoting the U.S. flag fleet, perhaps even make this a competitive advantage that maybe could be commercially promoted for U.S. flag fleet use. But we have to be careful here because we need to walk a fine line of calling winners and losers and kind of the promoting of the secondary ports or tertiary ports. I like it, but it's also, we just have to be careful manipulating the market. Certainly requiring the exports or preferential on the exports. I don't hate it, but it just, like I said, I get a little nervous. I want to see more data, more studies, more background, more whatever on what the ultimate long-term ramifications are. If it's going to affect the industry, obviously it's going to affect the industry. Look, one thing that we've seen is that despite outside injection of rules, regs, whatever it is, the market's still going to do what the market wants to do. So these artificial injections of kind of correction of the market, we just have to know what we're doing, right? We have to walk into it eyes wide open. I'm interested to see more about this berthing preferential treatment rule, but I'd like to know more, obviously. I'm going to keep watching. So that's only topic number one. Topic number two, story number two. Taking inventory of the rulemakings that the FMC is actually working on, right? We haven't really checked in on these recently. So we have a couple that are out there. So we have the unreasonable refusal to deal or negotiate with respect to vessel space accommodations. We have the detention and demurrage, prohibited practices, and we have the unfair, unjustly discriminatory methods. All three rules are still pending. So let's go back. Unreasonable refusal to deal or negotiate with respect to vessel space accommodations. This one, we still don't have language on the unreasonable refusal to deal or negotiate, but the FMC did tell us that they plan to open up another rulemaking. They want to do a supplemental notice of proposed rulemaking, and they want to dive further into questions raised by all the comments. Chairman Maffei has said that this one is probably the trickiest of all the rules that they've done because they have to make sure that they get it right, and they also want to make sure that they don't accidentally get things wrong. They don't want to have these unintended consequences that I keep talking about, that I think any lawyer who is watching and following all of this stuff is probably saying the same thing, right? We want to make sure that we're moving in the right direction without accidentally bumping into the wrong direction. So this rule is interesting. It was supposed to be finished up in 6 months, which means that it was supposed to be finished up December 16th. We're well past that. Chairman Maffei addressed it at the recent T&I, Transportation Infrastructure House Committee hearing meeting, and basically said, we're working on it. We thought that it was more important to get this correct. And he said before at the FMC Commission hearing, getting it right is more important than getting it fast. This one, we're going to see it again, right? We're going to have it open for comments. I'm going to let you know when that gets reopened for comments. At the time of the T&I hearing 2 weeks ago, he said that he expected it to be out maybe end of the week, certainly end of the month. We're getting close. I think that we're going to have some language out of this unreasonable refusal to deal or negotiate with respect to vessel-based accommodations that was kind of intended to be for this export protecting side. I think we've seen it expand now to be more import and export. Remember, this was the documented export strategy one. There's a lot of requests for clarification over what a documented export strategy looks like, if it's the threshold or just one of the criteria the FMC is considered for apparent unreasonableness to negotiate. This one's going to have some really interesting next round comments for it. So I'll keep watching. All right, the next rule. Detention and demurrage prohibited practices. So comments closed December 15th. We're still waiting on what I think is going to be a final rule. So like I said, Chairman Maffei talked about some of these rulemakings in the budget justification hearing at the Transportation and Infrastructure T&I committee hearing. He said that the final text is being drafted. So whether that was just a quick way of saying, we're going to the next round, I had said maybe there might be another supplemental on this, being that it's taking so long. I think this one is going to be a little bit more direct. I'm interested to see what happens with the 30-day invoicing and then 30 days dispute. The FMC had proposed a few thresholds of when things happen. We've talked about that operationally. It doesn't always happen that way, right? Sometimes operationally, the invoice isn't even issued, or maybe it's instantly issued, and so you're instantly delinquent because you have to pay it before you can pick up. And so what happens in that situation? What happens if you have to pay it before you pick up and then you want to dispute it, but you've already paid it? It's a lot harder to get the money back, right, than it is to get a waiver. However, we've seen some of the carriers already out there, some of the carriers and some of the terminals say that they're adopting some of these FMC, really they're proposals on who can pay and what it looks like and when detention or demurrage will be charged and when it won't. But based on kind of the tea leaves of this rulemaking. So I'm interested to see the final rule. I think the final rule will probably have a 30-day implementation section. Maybe that's why all the carriers are falling in line. Maybe they know something from the VOCC audit committee, from the commission saying, look, this is coming soon. You might want to get your ducks in a row. Maybe that's what they're doing. For the most part, they have to give 30 days notice. All tariff rates should have 30 days notice as a general statement. Check with your attorney if you have questions on that specifically. But in general, kind of 30 days is the threshold for rate changes. Maybe we're getting close. Maybe we're getting close to all that. So detention, demurrage, prohibited practices. This rule, I think we're going to see a final text come out from it and then an enforcement that comes along with it. Maybe next month, maybe May. Maybe they have to finish this up by June 16th. I don't know. This one, I think they had, almost 200 comments filed. They have a lot to go through. And the third rulemaking, unfair, unjustly discriminatory methods. We still don't have any language from this. I am so interested to see this, especially from all the language that the VOCC audit teams has been kind of issuing, right? The FMC has these VOCC audit teams, which Chairman Maffei said that is something that he actually set up when he first became chairman. So what they do is, these audit teams really communicate openly with the carriers, as they should anyways. The FMC, that's their responsibility to make sure that they're talking to all of the regulated entities. But they're keeping that to open dialogue and making sure that the carriers are also kind of privy to what the FMC finds as best practices. And they, one of the comments that the chairman said at one point was, the Ocean Shipping Reform Act made it clear that it's absolutely illegal for ocean carriers to discriminate or retaliate against a shipper for filing a complaint or challenging a charge. The FMC will thoroughly investigate any allegation of illegal behavior and prosecute aggressively when warranted. He's sending out a little bit of a warning there, basically saying, look, it is illegal to discriminate or retaliate if somebody files a complaint against you or challenges a charge. I think that we're seeing all of that clean up across the board. I want to see this language, right? I want to see what this unfair, unjustly discriminatory language looks like. No update on that yet. All right, story number three, the Maritime Transportation Data Initiative. I think we're getting closer to the MTDI, the Maritime Transportation Data Initiative report. Or so it seems, right? It seems that Commissioner Bensel's out there talking to stakeholders. He was recently in Europe, and then yesterday, saw that he was down in Texas at the Port of the Future conference hosted by the University of Houston under the Supply Chain and Logistics Technology program, directed by Margaret Kidd. If you don't follow her on LinkedIn, you definitely should. She has some really interesting programs and posts that she puts up. But from the meeting in Europe, so that was the Texas conference that's happening this week, but Commissioner Bensel was out in Europe, and it looked like both Commissioner Bensel and DCSA, the Digital Container Shipping Association, both released statements from their meeting, from their meeting that happened. So from those statements, it looks like at least Commissioner Bensel would like to see, and the statement said everything was great. This was a great meeting. Happy to work together, which I love to see it. I love to see any sort of stakeholder engagement, and I think that working with DCSA is a great move for Commissioner Bensel. But basically what Commissioner Bensel in his statement was saying was he would, I think is what I'm reading, he'd like to see, and he says with the caveat of if the public would like it, a rulemaking to come from the work of the MTDI. I think that's interesting because I'm getting more and more excited to see what's actually in the MTDI. It looks like at least one of those suggestions is going to be a rulemaking. And I guess that's Not surprising. We've certainly seen reports come with rulemaking suggestions, but I just love to see action, right? Like I love to see a proposal. And so that certainly makes sense. Like I said, Commissioner Dye, in most all of her reports, from her fact findings and certainly her supply chain innovation teams, usually had some sort of a rulemaking proposal. This certainly wouldn't be the first time. And that's, as we know from those of you who listen to By Land and By Sea, why detention demurrage rulemaking started at the beginning. It was an advance notice of proposed rulemaking brought out the spring of 2022. And if you remember, OSRA 2022 didn't come out till June. They had already started a detention and demurrage rulemaking when the House or when Congress generally said, you should do a rulemaking on detention and demurrage. And the FMC was like, we got it. We started it. But yeah, so I also want to read off one of Commissioner Bensel's quotes that I thought was really interesting. So he said, DCSA's standards fit these criteria and provide an excellent basis on which to develop our national standard for maritime data exchange. However, due to their voluntary nature, the adoption of these standards has been slow, too slow. Therefore, it might be a useful exercise to solicit feedback from the public on whether a rulemaking could be beneficial. That's what I'm saying. See, he said, solicit feedback from the public on whether a rulemaking. So I think he's still, sounds like he's interested in rulemaking. Continuing on, I do not intend to set detailed requirements, but rather to harmonize existing information to be maximized to provide real-time information and to create guardrails, ensuring it's properly conveyed to the shipping public. We've talked about that before. We just love to see guardrails, right? Nothing too specific, but guardrails of an industry. And I think that that's been the movement of the FMC recently. They are really trying to not get too specific, not get too controlling over the industry, but provide guardrails so that we can kind of just keep the industry in line. I also keep seeing the DCSA, this Digital Container Shipping Association, their standards as really being hailed and kind of as Commissioner Bensel says, an excellent basis on which to develop our national standard for maritime data exchange. One thing that I put in a LinkedIn post recently is I think it's worth looking at DCSA standards. They have a glossary. They have some really interesting stuff up there. I've talked about them a few times before, but look, I disagree a little bit with Bensel here. He said that the DCSA standards have been too slow to be adopted. Look, DCSA has only been around since 2019. They're a nonprofit independent organization started in 2019. We're only 3 years, right? 3 years, 3.5, 4 years from that. I think that's pretty fast. But look, it also sounds like Bensel may be interested in adding some oomph to the faster adoption of standards generally, which, that's probably a step in the right direction toward greater visibility in data and the overall flow of goods. I do want to kind of just pull back a little bit here. So what is MTDI? If you've forgotten what this Maritime Transportation Data Initiative is, it is Chairman Maffei of the FMC directed Commissioner Carl Bensel to lead a data initiative. So he held meetings between December 2021 and June 2022, where then he ultimately had a data summit. And so there were three main things that he was focusing on in his MTDI work, Commissioner Bensel, that is. The first was cataloging the status quo in maritime data elements, metrics, transmissions, and access. The second was identifying key gaps in data definitions and classifications. And the third was developing recommendations for common data standards and access policy protocols. So that's right. So he was seeing what we had out there, cataloging, he's identifying gaps, and then he's developing these recommendations. And that's obviously where I'm interested. I want to see what the recommendations are. Like I said, looks like maybe a rulemaking is one of those recommendations. I think this is cool. I'm going to continue to watch. I think we're getting closer. I think the more that I see Commissioner Bensel out there, the more I think we're getting closer for an MTDI report to be coming out. All right, and the last topic, or story number 4, the last thing that I really just want to bring to your attention, and I said we were going to be quick, and here we are almost a half hour in, is that I'm following Laura Curtis out of Bloomberg. She's a reporter for Bloomberg. She's been, last night and today, interesting articles are coming out basically saying that the labor in LA Long Beach, there's something going on there, right? That LA Long Beach was shut down last night due to lack of workers or a pullback of workers. And then that also happened this morning. I'm also watching Ian Weiland. He's providing some boots on the ground. He's a drayage provider out in LA Long Beach area who confirms that, yeah, the ports are shut down. Look, at least initially, It seems like the talk is that maybe it might be tied to ongoing negotiations between the labor and the terminals. I've also seen that maybe there was a directors meeting that was happening last night, and that's why they didn't have as many labor available for the terminals to work. I don't know. Look, so if you'll remember, both sides have actually agreed not to air the dirty laundry, right? Or really any laundry at all. They both agreed that they weren't going to talk to the press or anybody. They were just going to focus on the negotiation. And these negotiations have been going on since June 30th of 2022. We haven't had a contract since that July 1st, that very next day. July 1st was the first day of not having a contract between the Pacific Maritime Association and the ILWU on the West Coast, the labor union. What's going on here, right? Like, is this something of a negotiation breakdown? Is this less important than, or I don't want to say important, less, I guess, I don't want to say nefarious. Is it less dramatic than that? Without workers, look, the port's effectively shut down, right? And that's not good. Even if it's a simple non-negotiation reason, ports being shut down causes backups. We saw what backups can do to the overall supply chain through COVID. I'm just hoping this gets resolved quickly. Interesting, right? We don't want to see, we've had commitments from both sides say we do not intend to disrupt the flow of goods. And now we have ports shut down for last night and at least this morning. I don't know. Let's hope this one gets resolved quickly. I wanted to highlight it, something to watch. All right. Well, thanks for joining me today. Sometimes it's good just to take inventory of all the moving parts and let you in on the checklist of what I'm kind of watching. And I think we did that, right? We went over the bills and then we went over the rulemakings that are out there and the MTDI report. Thanks for joining. As always here, the guidance is general and for educational purposes. It should not be construed to be legal advice directly related to your matter. If you need an attorney, contact an attorney. But if you have specific legal questions, feel free to reach out to me at my legal company, Squall Strategies. Otherwise, for the non-legal questions, the e-learning, and general industry information and insights, come find me at the Maritime Professor. If you like these videos, let me know. Comment, like, and share. If you want to listen to these episodes on demand, or if you missed any previous episodes, check out the podcast by Land and by Sea. If you prefer to see the video, they live on my YouTube page, By Land and by Sea, presented by the Maritime Professor. And while you're at it, check out the website, maritimeprofessor.com. So until next week, this is Lauren Beacon, the Maritime Professor, and you've just listened to By Land and by Sea. See you next time.